a good year that's like, yes, I will hop on a plane and fly to Scotland and disappear for a year.
Fair
So
enough.
that's where I'm at.
Okay, okay, awesome. So I think like we can take you through like our journey and maybe like let us know if things are not like really relevant or if you find like there might be some things that you're more interested in than others. So just ask us about it and we can talk more
Yeah,
to
feel
that.
free to interrupt at any point since you're like our only audience as well. So yeah.
So, well, why don't we get started? So, we're just going to take you through the journey. And I think one of the biggest differences between undergrad and grad school is that undergrad is very structured because you have all of the coursework there. You're already, you typically like build your own schedules and then you just follow it. But grad school is a lot different in the sense that because you don't have as much coursework per se. Like you might have a lot of coursework, but it really depends on you. You will get a little bit more flexibility around what you're doing with your thesis because you're basically in control of that project. So I think what you'll realize is that doing it by yourself, there's going to be a lot more unexpected detours, and you're going to have to do some things that are different and maybe not typically up your comfort zone. So for me, that's been the case because as I mentioned, I went into biomedical engineering. So a lot of the things that I was exposed to was really new. So I got involved in startup business after working on technology, which was a little bit of a wearable, a wheelchair wearable that we designed for basically tracking activity data. And what we did was we commercialized that into a company. So a lot of my thesis was that knowledge mobilization to actually see if we can put this into the market and see if users would actually take hold of it. So that was a little bit of what I did. And I think I just jumped around there, but I think I want to go back to just where do you start really? Like how do you even like maybe make this decision, and how do you and what are the requirements in order to get there? So for application, um, pardon? Oh, sorry. Yes, Peter can also jump in, but essentially, I think for me, I think choosing this lab has been an important part of my application. So being able to work in that lab during my summer in my undergrad has really been a useful step in making my decision to pursue grad school because working in there over the summer has really been helpful in making helping me know like understand the team dynamic, but also understand how my prof was like because that's an important consideration as well because you don't want a supervisor who's too restrictive but also not at the same time too, I guess, free in the sense that he won't offer you enough guidance. He or she won't offer you enough guidance during the process either.
Yeah, so we can kind of get into the whole cycle of how grad school works. So we have kind of like a timeline that we made. So we start off kind of with the application process. So the application process itself is typically something that's different for every graduate program.
Yeah.
So for most graduate programs, though, there's letters of references, personal statements, and there's going to be kind of like a holistic evaluation of your previous transcript and perhaps your resume. So typically for letters of reference, it's always a good idea to keep in touch with like to have a network when you're in undergrad. So that could mean talking to profs from different classes. It could mean profs that you worked under. It could mean other employers. So it's really about building a good network and harnessing that network to
Which
your.
I think you're doing well because if you wanted to do something like publishing, then you can use Austin
Yeah,
as a
Austin's
great
definitely a
strat.
great reference for you. And yeah, and also then once you get those letters of reference, it's also making sure that your personal statement is really good. So that could mean spinning how you've done certain things in undergrad. Could mean kind of selling yourself in a different way. So depending on your graduate program that you're interested in, it could mean like kind of if you're going into like let's say anthropology, you might want to kind of spin yourself into like your different positions. Maybe you can say that you're a writer, but you were doing anthropology work pieces or something like that. So it's really important to kind of sell yourself in that kind of um, thematic way, I guess. And then the last thing is really um, to sell yourself as like somebody who can do it, right? So one of the things that was important for when I was applying was also kind of talking about what I did during years where my grades weren't the best or years where I took a break. So I think it's really important to kind of sell that, sell your experience in a good way. So like, let's say you had a gap year, for example. It's more important. It's not important kind of to say, oh, because I have a gap year, this is kind of a problem, but it's more important to say, during this gap year, I did this, and really try to sell yourself in that way. So I think your personal statement will also go a really long way. Um, yeah, and with that, once you kind of get into grad school after the whole application process, and the other thing with applications is to not kind of restrict yourself to one school or one program. It's to just kind of keep applying to different programs, and also based on your interests, of course. For example, for me, I was more interested in kind of the medical sciences area. So for me, it didn't really matter like the kind of research I did matter, but there were several, like there was a lot of research areas that I was interested in. So I ended up applying to all of those programs, which I don't think is bad, because once you get in, then you can kind of decide or based on which ones you get into, you can decide which one you want to go into as well. So it's always good to do more than one application. The other thing is, once you're actually in grad school, there's a lot of kind of applying to awards and fundings to try to sustain yourself. And John can kind of talk a little bit more about that.
So before I do you have any questions, Kyra?
I guess I do only have one. You were talking a lot about that personal statement. Where does
Yeah.
that fit into the application process?
So it's one of the holistic considerations that they have in at least like for the schools that we've been applying to. So we've applied to U of A, U of C, and UBC. So a lot of these schools, what they do is they'll ask you a personal question. So typically, and some schools might not even have a prompt, but typically they would be something like, what was one thing that happened? Say it could be like an extenuating circumstance. Like what was one struggle or challenge that you faced, or it could be, and how did you overcome it? Or it could be something like, what your biggest achievement, right? So, and you really have to play their game a little bit, because some schools, what they're looking for is, they might be like looking at achievements and thinking like, oh, we want a little bit more of a holistic like character, as opposed to looking at your like transcript and your achievements like more professionally, if you will. So like, for example, like one of the biggest achievements could be, say, raising your siblings, or raising like a younger son or cousin or something like that, as opposed to, say, my biggest achievement was winning this $5 million award.
Yeah,
right?
I guess like the main thing is kind of making that distinction between like a personal statement versus like a professional
Yeah.
kind of statement. You have to really read into their question and see what they're asking. Sometimes some schools are just like, oh, we require a personal statement. They won't give you too much guidelines. So in those cases, you kind of have more of more freedom with what you decide to do. But usually it's always better, I think, to focus on kind of the personal achievements more than your professional achievement. I mean, or even like tie in your professional achievements to your personal achievements. So say like, yeah, I decided to be a writer, but this is because, not because like, maybe like don't say, oh, because of, not just because of like professional like goals just to publish or anything like that, but also because you feel motivated, you feel passionate about
Yeah.
writing about the subject, and it's something that defines who you are as a person. And ultimately what they want to see is that you like there's something there's that inherent
Like
or like
intrinsic motivation.
intrinsic motivation to like do what you like do like pursue the field that you like. So it's just to kind of show them that once you get into the program, you'll make really good use of the program as well. So I think, yeah, it goes a long way how personal you make it. And also you kind of have to read into their questions because it's going to be different for every program, for every university.
Yeah, I think it's a good activity regardless because it just shows to like you're probably going to spend 2 to 3 years if you do get into grad school. So it's really good just to have that like intrinsic motivation, right? Like really doing this because you want to do it as opposed to doing it just so that like, you can add it to your CV type of thing.
Yeah, it's just something that everyone has to really think about in the end.
Yeah, so next I wanted to talk a little bit about awards. So I don't know, like particularly, like sometimes there's a lot of restrictions in different schools, but typically when you're doing research projects, you can apply for awards or funding. And so I've had a lot of projects when I first started, and I actually didn't get funding until my second year. So it really is something that you have to keep on trying and keep trying to pitch your project in different ways. So it's a really good skill to have to be able to pitch, say, something in one realm or like one discipline into a completely different discipline and essentially try to get funding by meeting certain criteria that the funding agencies lay out. So, for example, I was doing my research in injury prevention and wheelchair biomechanics. And what I had to do was I applied for a funding source, which was an accessibility organization. So I had to put a different spin on it in order to really qualify for that funding. But I think like what you'll realize is that like the funding agencies are also like they're all made of humans as opposed to how a lot of people code it. So if you really like try to appeal to that human emotion for funding, I think that you can also get funded for your work because a lot of people like during grad school, it's a really important part. It was an important part for me, at least, in my transition into sort of adulthood. So I think really being able to find that independence and being able to self-sustain myself through the funded activities was something that was really important to me. So that's something that you should look at as soon as like you could even look at it like starting now. Like once you have that initial sort of ambition to pursue grad school, I really think you should look into different funding sources and funding agencies. And they don't necessarily have to be like high quality funding sources necessarily. They could even be something as easy, like as simple as internal funding. So you could try and find a supervisor who has the resources to fund his or her students, and then you would be able to approach that person and see if you could pursue something with them.
Yeah, and also with scholarships, it's important to kind of keep in mind like what your department is and like what there's kind of like a history of students or like what kind of history it has for students getting scholarships. So it's really important to do some research before you apply to any program to see what kind of opportunities they have. Because for John, anyways, for him, it was really hard because his department wasn't really like funded that well.
Mhm.
So he had to rely on external funding a lot. So for me, though, my department was really big. So I was in the Department of Medical Sciences, Department of Pediatrics. So they have like a lot of funding sources because the department itself is really big. So it can also come down to kind of doing some preliminary research and understanding what kind of funding is out there, what kind of scholarships have students received already, and also to kind of also understand your own kind of financial situation because scholarships are often not just like a means for kind of having things for the CV. It's also kind of a way that you support yourself in grad school. So because of that, it's important to make sure that before you apply to grad school, there's like the program will allow you to find good funding sources. So it has to be a program that really allows you to kind of expand in that sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and with that, we can jump into coursework. So, John, you want to talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. So like depending on your coursework needs, you could basically choose as much or as little generally for graduate programs, but also keep in mind that certain graduate programs do have requirements. So you might need ethics training, you might need to fill a certain level of preliminary coursework. So a lot of graduate programs have something like um, your area of interest 600, and essentially what this course would be like a really introductory level course where students can come together and discuss with other graduate students in the same field and really make things like sort of like a journal club style
Yeah,
where you
typically
can
they're all seminar courses. So, well, I mean, mostly seminar courses. So it's usually small group courses. So usually it's similar to some of the undergrad courses, except that there's going to be more discussion focused.
yeah but
With
also
coursework, it's not as heavy though. Especially for thesis programs, it's usually meant to be very light and just to kind of augment your research. So yeah, so coursework is going to be a little less light. It's usually a bit easier than undergrad, I found, for me personally, but it will depend based on your program, of course, in the end. And with that, we can kind of jump into research as well, because
mhm.
your coursework is really there to augment your research. So what ends up happening with research is you have a project proposal that you make at the beginning of the year or whenever you start your program. You talk with your supervisor and you look at the existing literature. So maybe you might do a literature review or some kind of or try to make a proposal of some sort about some kind of novel area that you want to do research in. And once you kind of organize your thoughts, talk through it with your supervisor, you kind of have to pitch it to a committee to kind of get their approval for doing that research. So obviously that's going to be, so the committee, I'm going to let John talk a little bit more about, but typically um, the supervisor can usually find committee members for you in certain programs, but other programs, you're the one who has to find other committee members. And typically committee members are just members of the university. So there's,
So
yeah,
in most cases, there's going to be an external committee member, there's going to be an internal committee member, and there's going to be your supervisor. The external is someone who is arm's length to your field, so someone who is working in that same field, say, more or less. The internal would be someone who is working directly for the department or the faculty that you're enrolled in, and they will be someone who has basically little to no idea about your topic of interest. And your supervisor is going to be the one who you've been working with directly and has been really involved in your project design and maybe additional forms of guidance.
so
So
they'll know the most about your project.
yeah, and then that brings us to, so after you do your research, which we're not going to get into because I think
It
a lot,
will differ
yeah, it'll
for
differ for
everyone.
everyone. At the end, you'll have to do a defense. And since Peter here just defended, I'll let him.
I can talk about that. Well, I mean, we missed this point though. I guess with your research comes publications as well.
Right.
So publications are really important. And if you went to Austin's last talk on grad school and publications, you would have heard how much he stressed publications are really important for grad school. And it is really important because in the end, it's kind of like a measurement of how productive you are throughout
Yeah.
your program. So it can come down to a lot in your final evaluation.
And I think it's really important just to choose, when you're choosing the supervisor that you want to work under, you should also take some research into their previous publication record and see how historically they've been publishing and whether they like to put students on as first authors and things like that.
Yeah.
Because it's really going to affect how much you're able to publish as well. especially if you're going to publishing.
Yeah.
Can I
So
jump in with a question?
yes,
Story. So when you say that, I unfortunately I missed Austin's talk, but when you say that publication is super important,
yes.
is that only the publishing that you do while you're in grad school, or is that the publishing that you do before grad school as well as what you do while you're in grad school?
Well, definitely before grad school is going to be really helpful as well.
Hmm.
But it's also important to sustain that throughout grad school as well.
Yeah.
So, well, when you're thinking about just kind of getting into back to the application bit, when you're thinking about kind of getting into grad school, it's also important to have like a good CV of, so if you're looking into publications as an area, it's definitely good to have a good CV with a list of publications. If you can, most grad schools that we've applied to, they didn't have a limit for your CV. So typically you can make it as long as you want to. So
Hmm.
it's always a good idea to kind of list it out and just kind of overwhelm them with publications if you can.
Yeah. And
Um,
also don't take publications to like in illiterally, I suppose. Publications can include things like patents. It can include things like presentations, as long as they're for peer-reviewed academic bodies. So like we have a lot of
Even non-peer
presentations,
reviewed,
right?
like
And no,
magazines
yeah, and magazines and things. Yeah,
newspapers.
for sure. I think those are all really good to include under publications.
Yeah. Yeah, and also with once you're in grad school, publications also go a long way because a lot of your what you're writing for your thesis is going to be based on what you publish.
Publish. Yeah.
So sometimes certain grad programs don't require publishing, but since you're going into publishing, Hara, I think it will be really important that you publish because a lot of the things that you're writing in your thesis could be following a paper-based format. So what that means is you would kind of put together your papers into different chapters throughout your thesis that you submit at the end. And with that, it could be really easy to write the whole thesis because that's going to be what you're doing throughout your degree. There's also something called a traditional style thesis, where you kind of summarize your research that you do. Typically, it might differ for programs, but typically it's going to be you'd write a traditional style thesis if you didn't get as much publications as you wanted to, or if you want to follow kind of like a different format in how you report your results from your research. So ultimately, though, in the end, if you publish, that's typically what's going to be put together for your final thesis defense. And yeah, and then while we're on the topic of defense, typically for the science programs, is anyways, like if it's an MSc, typically, or like a PhD, typically that means defending your research but in front of your full committee as well as public portion of a defense. So the public portion is kind of open to everyone. So anyone in your department, anyone that you invite, pretty much the general public can come. And typically the general public is allowed to watch you. You typically do like a 30 to 40-minute talk on your entire project. And then there's like a 5 to 10 minute question period where you answer the questions of the public and just the also, but during that time, your committee can't ask you any questions. And then after that, there's going to be like a defense portion. So that's where your committee members will start asking you questions, and all the general public will leave at that point, and the committee members will just kind of grill you away as they please, kind of to make you kind of defend your ideas. So that's the kind of the defense portion. And how well you do your defense will determine if you pass or fail. Typically, though, I think
Most
most
people
people will
pass.
pass if they schedule a defense, but um, because usually the committee members would only agree to the defense if they believe that you're ready to defend. But on the in the off cases, maybe there might be some people that fail, and usually it's going to be it's going to be, I don't know usually why people fail though. I think mostly it's just due to like, oh, you failed to meet this requirement or that requirement, and it's usually something that you can kind of control, and once you meet that requirement, they'll let you pass. So typically, once you're done with your defense, you're kind of you can pass and typically apply for graduation after that, because that's where I'm sitting at right now.
So I think we have to stop there because it's 11. But Kyra, did you have any last questions?
I don't think so. That was really enlightening because I've done thinking about grad school, but I've never actively been like, yes, this is how I'm going to go through the process. And it was really eye-opening just to think about kind of how things are going to work once I take that step.
Awesome.
Right.
Yeah. And obviously, like, we're not, well, neither me nor Peter are from publishing. So I think a really great step for you would be to see if there's other graduate students or work your networks really and see if you can find someone who's done this before, and they might have a lot better advice than us because neither of us have taken, a publishing relevant grad school. And what you'll notice is that grad school differs for every single program.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think
Absolutely. This was awesome. Thank you so
awesome.
much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.
All right. Take care.
Absolutely. We'll see you on Monday.
Bye.